What up? What up? The Sixers have a new head coach, and his name is Nick Nurse. How about it? Welcome to the Sixers Talk podcast, brought to you by Wilmington University, Wilmu Works, Danny Pommells, Noah Levick, Ben Berry, our producer in the cut, as always. We're here for a good time, not a long time. This won't be one of our juicy, lengthy podcasts, but the obvious hiring of Nick Nurse is a reason to pod, and that's why we are here. How about it, Noah? What was your reaction to Nick Nurse getting the job? And then the reports on top of that he turned down the Phoenix Suns opportunity and withdrew from the Bucks job position. And I think that may be more that his assistant was also in the running for that. That would be my guess about that. But what did you make of the hiring and the other jobs that he turned down to come here to Philly to be reunited with Daryl Morey?
Yeah, a couple other intriguing jobs definitely on the market. So I think it does speak to just the opportunity to coach the MVP of the league and a team that still has potential despite these recent disappointments. All that stuff is legitimately really attractive, and Nick Nurse is evidence of that. I think last time I said, look, there are a bunch of strong coaches out there, but to me, it's hard to consider Nick Nurse anything besides extraordinarily well qualified for this job. I think for the Sixers, they're in a position where, on one hand, like a known quantity is appealing, right? And Nick Nurse has won an NBA Finals. He's been a coach of the year. But I think the other side of this that just feels really sensible is they need to find those wins on the margins, and that is ultimately the avenue, to get beyond the second round, other than all the obvious stuff, like the stars need to play better in the big games. Can you get a few more possessions a game? Can you confuse an opposition with a defense they're not expecting? And I think in that specific way, Nick Nurse is just so obviously an appealing head coach for this team. As we'll get into, he doesn't have a flawless track record. There are reasons that this might not work out so great. I think his style can potentially wear thin. I think it's valid to wonder if his aggressive defense will be so effective here with different personnel. But to me, just on that surface level of the general type of candidate that made sense for the Sixers, he was a pretty nice match. And even getting simpler, the standpoint of have you won games at a high level? Have you coached well in the postseason before? Have you won an NBA title? He's checking all those boxes as well. So I think if you're looking for reasons to feel good about this hire, to be encouraged, just the fact that Nick Nurse is checking so many of these boxes does give you some of that optimism if you're the type to seek that.
I think I'm the most optimistic with the fact that he has been in high pressure situations and succeeded in those high pressure situations. Whoever they bring in or have brought in, the seat is going to be hot immediately. This is a high pressure, a high stakes job. They haven't won a championship in 40 years. Like there's no sugarcoating that. And the coach that comes in is going to be expected to deliver dividends. And would his life as a head coach here in Philly be extended if he doesn't win a championship by just getting by past the second round and into more meaningful, deeper playoff runs? Yes, definitely. But the championship is what everyone is in search of, maximizing Joel Embiid's window or what is left of it. And it's interesting. I mean, Daryl Morey just seems to have a great affinity for the past research he's put into hiring people and those past relationships, and bringing in people that he's familiar with. So he and Nick Nurse used to be co-workers with the Houston Rockets when he hired Nurse to be the coach of their G League affiliate. And that was over 10 years ago, but he's, drawn back on those past relationships like he did with Harden, like he did with, Daniel House and, all those other guys that Montrezl Harrell, who he may have had some familiarity with along the way, and who Harden himself has had familiarity with as well. So it'll be interesting to see how the Nurse's hiring reflects on whether Harden stays or goes. But first and foremost, I want to assume that Joel Embiid blessed, this relationship and this job, because they had some animosity, whether it be, between the lines and competitiveness and what have you, but they have had some back and forth, and it's not hard to remember, the tension and the angst between the Raptors and the Sixers and certain playoff runs and whatnot. But I really don't know how to feel about it. I feel like Sam Cassell was a guy I felt had some inroads, not necessarily by what was reported or what I had seen within the front office, but just from the eye test of his relationship with the players, which I outlined previously in other podcasts. But, I'm willing to wait and see and give Nick Nurse a chance. I'm not blown away by the hire, and I don't know if it's going to be the thing that leads to them having success. I think it's going to be more of a personnel thing than it will be the coaching hire making the difference with this team. But do you feel like his hiring reflects either way on how they'll deal with Harden here in the offseason, or if Harden makes his decision? Because I'm sure they had to bring that up. Like, what's your plan with the Sixers if Harden stays or if he decides to walk?
Yeah, I think it's probably not super responsible or mature to read too much into that. I think, no doubt, if they hired Mike D'Antoni, that's a clear indication that you're very strongly attracted to the idea of James Harden being back here and like the idea of a reunion. But as you said, yeah, this is another little Philadelphia Rockets connection. To me, I think the D'Antoni hiring, though there would have been compelling reasons for it, would have been a lot more open to that specific criticism of it probably wouldn't have happened if these guys hadn't worked together before. I just think with Nick Nurse, as you brought up, was a finalist for these other prestigious jobs out there. And I think that speaks to he's been a fantastic NBA head coach before, and there's reasons to think he could do excellent work again. Now, that said, it didn't end very well in Toronto. Just the very last game of their season, they blow a big lead, losing the play-in tournament, and definitely some real tension there with Masai Ujiri and Nick Nurse and that partnership. And I think Nurse is an extremely intense personality, for better and for worse. So if you're winning games, I think everyone's happy, and they love a coach who is so hungry for victories every night. But when those victories aren't happening, I think there's evidence that he becomes frustrated when players aren't meeting his standard. And he's not shy about voicing that and about being harsh with his decisions in terms of the way he structures his rotations, when he considers guys worthy of minutes, that sort of thing. So some real question marks there for me, both in terms of his broad leadership style, and then also how does that reflect the on-court decision-making. And of course, a big pertinent issue here is how many minutes are the stars going to play? Because just these past couple seasons, the management of the minutes for Van Vliet, Siakam, Barnes, it hasn't been good. Those guys have been playing way too many minutes in the regular season. And we saw when the Sixers matched up against the Raptors, Fred Van Vliet was an all-star player that year, but he was diminished and even missing games during that series due to injury. So I think with Joel Embiid, there's always been this delicate balance of how do you prepare him for the postseason, but then also just how do you ensure he arrives at the postseason healthy and close to 100% health. So on paper, Nick Nurse, I think, is not the ideal candidate for that narrow yet very important area, but clearly that'll be a collaboration. He'll be talking a lot with Daryl Morey, with the Sixers medical folks, with Joel Embiid, and they'll hope to nail those tough decisions on when do you give Embiid a night off, when do you decide that the extra 3 or 4 minutes aren't worth it, even if you might lose this particular regular season game. So that type of stuff for me will be interesting to track with Nick Nurse, because this guy just at a basic level loves to win, has done it in so many different places, just has a lot of pride, I think, in night-to-night competitiveness and making life tough for the opposition. But when it comes to your star players, especially if Joel Embiid is one of those stars, that obviously can't mean 42 minutes in some February game that doesn't mean very much in the big picture.
Let's pay some bills here. We are, of course, brought to you by Wilmington University, and Wilmington University and students are in the game. Upskill in fields like cybersecurity, fintech, healthcare, and education, in person or online. Get in the game at Wilmington University. Find us at wilmu.edu. It's time to rush to new rewards at Rivers Casino. Now there's a whole new way for you to earn, redeem, and level up your rewards. Get your new Rush Rewards card and get more out of your game at Rivers Casino, Philadelphia. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Back here on the Sixers Talk podcast, and Nick Nurse is the Sixers' new head coach. He 2019 Coach of the Year, led the Raptors to the NBA championship in his first year, lauded for his defensive prowess and incorporating his own defense into mainly a lot of the defense that Toronto ran, and maybe other guys around the league also heralded that. Spoelstra maybe comes to mind as well. But I'm curious though, with his defensive prowess, there on the flip side, Toronto as an organization has received a lot of praise and adulation for how they've developed undrafted players, second round picks, unheralded players. You bring up Fred VanVleet. There's plenty of guys there on their roster who come to mind. But do you feel like, as far as his staff, that he'll be hiring like an offensive minded coach to kind of offset what he brings to the table? Similar with maybe how Dave Yeager came in with Doc Rivers and whatnot?
It'll be intriguing. Yeah, I think that would make sense. Like, honestly, retaining Dave Yeager, if Yeager is interested, I think sounds fair enough. Yeager, another guy known for being innovative and specializing more in the offensive side of the ball. But yeah, I think the player development question is interesting here, because the reality is, if you're leaning on your stars that much, there aren't as many opportunities for the young players to get minutes. And I think if you look at Nurse's track record in Toronto with player development, overall, it's not incredibly impressive. I think a lot of those guys already were somewhat established. And in terms of new guys coming into the system and thriving, not a ton of that in his past few years. But offensively, obviously, he's not a clueless head coach. If you actually look way back, he is the all-time record holder still at Northern Iowa for three-point shooting percentage. So he knows how to put up a jumper. He's published books on coaching and has strong beliefs about how shooting should be taught. But yeah, like the half-court offense in Toronto hasn't been a strength. I think on one hand, that's been just the personnel of the team. They've had a lot of players who are better at defense than offense in the past couple of years. But also, no doubt, like in structuring a staff, I think you feel more confident if there is someone who is sharp offensively and more of a specialist on that side of the ball. So I'm curious, what decisions he'll make there. I mean, he's coached 5 years in the NBA, right? So it's not someone like Doc Rivers who has people who are borderline fixtures on his staffs, like a Sam Cassell or like a Jamie Young, someone who's coached for Rivers in a couple destinations. I think Nurse can perhaps bring a couple folks over, but obviously has the freedom to ask around, see if anyone's interested. And also, the Sixers did have a very well-qualified group of assistant coaches. So if he sees fit, some of these guys, such as a Dave Yeager, could perhaps stick around. So I don't think it's easy to predict how that's going to play out. And just the reality is, too, like it wasn't a very harmonious end in Toronto. I don't think everyone felt great about the way that played out. So in my reading of the tea leaves right now, I don't think we're going to see a situation where, all the Toronto coaches are now Sixers assistant coaches. I imagine we might have somewhat of a hybrid where could have some holdovers, could have some outside additions, and you could have some former Raptors assistant coaches in the mix. But yeah, all those will be interesting decisions, and I think will be telling in terms of his philosophy initially here in Philly.
We are about 2 weeks from the Sixers getting embarrassingly knocked out of the playoffs in Game 7 against the against the Celtics, and the Jason Tatum 51-point game. We're on the precipice of Game 7 between the Celtics and Heat here to see who goes to the NBA Finals. What do you make of the search this time around? We know 3 years ago, Doc Rivers was hired, quicker than any of us could, sneeze. But here we're about 2 weeks removed from the Sixers' last game and Doc Rivers being let go. They end up with Nick Nurse. I'm not sure how many candidates they actually interviewed. I will put the list probably less than 5, based on reports. Could be more of that. Could be more. Could be less. But what did you make of the search? And did you feel like it was they got their man? I know you have explained earlier in the podcast how you felt like Nurse was a great fit and highly sought after for other high profile jobs, but did you feel like the search, they put their due diligence in, the Sixers?
Yeah, I think you can always do a bit more, but realistically, when a team says they've interviewed some outlandish number of candidates, 20 or 30, the large majority of those aren't legit interviews, right?
Right.
And I think,
or people they really think could get the job, right?
Yeah. So I think, based on what we know, it was reasonable enough how they looked at this. They recognized that there were a few candidates out there who, in their eyes, initially seemed like they'd make sense. They talked to a few people, and they landed on someone who has really strong credentials. It will be interesting, though, to hear from Daryl Morey exactly on how this process played out and what questions they did ask Nick Nurse, what concerns they might have had about him. But I think for me, the process with Rivers was certainly way more open to criticism, especially because that one was at a time of turmoil and transition for the Sixers organization. And they made that hire, and then shortly thereafter went into the Daryl Morey regime. And of course, the alignment wasn't there in the sense that Daryl Morey didn't actually hire the head coach. So I think this time around, good that Morey was the key decision maker. And yeah, I think no doubt this candidate was very, very well qualified and on paper worthy most certainly of a high profile head coaching position again. Like we said, has some flaws in his track record. There are some ways that this could go wrong for sure, but I just think you do want someone with a reputation for innovation when you're an organization that just keeps hitting that second round ceiling. And Nick Nurse, I think, likes imposing his style on other teams. He likes confusing opposing stars, and he likes finding those little creative ways that you can sneak a win in a playoff series or that you can trouble an opposition and catch them off their game. So, I think just judging the process based on what we know, no major ways that stand out to me that it was incredibly flawed or wrong.
Adrian Wojnarowski from ESPN broke the story, and Nick Nurse is the type of coach that a lot of teams were interested in. He won a championship with the Raptors, and we don't know as of right now what the parameters of the deal are. Is there anything specific about money or years that you would be curious how this deal is structured for Nurse?
Not really. I mean, I think the length of the contract is mildly interesting, and that something super long obviously conveys a good degree of confidence. But Doc Rivers, as he publicly stated, had 2 years left on his contract, and that didn't deter the Sixers from eating that money and firing him.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I think the Sixers ownership, though they've made a lot of dubious decisions during their time, have demonstrated a willingness to pay what is necessary to retain, high-level coaches or to, go over the tax or whatever. So, it wouldn't be something that I'd have a great degree of curiosity about. But yeah, if those terms become known, will be interesting to see. My assumption is, it's a multi-year lucrative deal, and whatever was necessary, the Sixers paid it. And obviously there are a bunch of factors here that matter besides money. Getting to coach Joel Embiid, getting to coach a team still with a lot of potential on paper, with a great young star in Tyrese Maxey. I'm sure all those factors were appealing to Nurse, as things beyond whatever the money amount that drew him to Philly is.
And particularly the difference with hiring Doc Rivers as opposed to hiring Nick Nurse is the familiarity. Like, Nick Nurse knows these players intimately, where Doc Rivers is playing in the Western Conference, not quite the same proximity. And I like that a lot. The fact that Nick Nurse knows this roster, the personnel, and has seen and, studied these players and knows them well. I think I'm most interested here as this coaching hire has been secured. Now we're kind of playing the James Harden game and trying to figure out or decide if he's worth keeping, or they're going to let him walk, or I'm going to assume he's going to opt out of that deal. But how do you see that Harden thing playing out? Is this going to be something that stretches deep into the summer, or do you feel like there's something that might get wrapped up sooner on the sooner side?
Well, you have this awkwardness, and I think the Sixers will pay special attention to it, of not being allowed to do stuff before, the NBA, permits it. So we're going to hear rumblings for a couple weeks, but we're not going to get rock solid confirmation of anything until, free agency actually hits. But yeah, I mean, he's going to decline the option. That's the expectation. And then, my understanding from the Sixers end is just the notion of paying him the absolute max of, 4 years, $200+ million doesn't sound logical. But that said, they would like him back. So I think that's the reality for now. And we'll hear a million things over the next few weeks, but I think it'll be tough to get a rock solid, this is 100% what is happening stamp on this until we're actually allowed to get that. So I think we're going to have, if you're a Sixers fan, you'll probably have to have some patience from that, even if it's a little unsatisfying. Like, the league just doesn't love the idea of there being resolutions to these sort of things before they're supposed to be. Sixers were docked the 2 second-round picks for the tampering last year. They don't want to pay him the max. Like, I think that's a no-brainer, right? Like, you want to retain Harden, but he's going to be in his mid-30s, and I don't think in game 6 or 7 he looked like a player worth, 4 years, $200+ million. So there's always some back and forth with this sort of stuff. Maybe they find a dollar in years amount that makes sense, but certainly seems quite possible that does not happen, and he ends up a Houston Rocket, and the Sixers will have to see what Plan B looks like here. So I'm sure behind the scenes they're working through all those possibilities, but if you're just looking for, okay, this is decided, like, that's not going to happen right now. We're going to have to wait a little bit for that, I think.
From a doc to a nurse, the Sixers starting a new regime, and could this lead to a championship? We will have to wait and see. Check out Noah Levick's work on NBCSportsPhiladelphia.com. For Ben Berry, I'm Danny Pommells. This has been the Sixers Talk podcast, brought to you by Wilmington University. Wilmu works. We'll see you next time.